The 43rd Annual National Groundwater Association Convention and Exposition was held in Washington, D.C., October 21st through the 23rd, 1991. A highlight of the National Convention is the keynote presentation given by the Darcy Lecturer. The Henry Darcy Distinguished Lecturer Program is sponsored by the Association of Groundwater Scientists and Engineers. The association annually chooses an individual to be offered as a visiting lecturer to a number of universities in North America. This program honors the historical discovery by Henry Darcy in 1856, which established the physical basis on which groundwater hydrology has been studied for more than a century. Dr. Stephen Wheatcraft has over 17 years' experience in the field of hydrogeology and transport in porous media. He has over 30 scientific publications in the area of containment transport in aquifers and soils, hydrogeophysics, island coastal hydrogeology, and numerical and laboratory modeling of seawater intrusion. He currently holds the position of Associate Research Professor of Hydrogeology at the Water Resources Center of the Desert Research Institute. He received an MS in 1976 and a PhD in Geology and Geophysics with specialization in hydrogeology from the University of Hawaii. His master's thesis involved laboratory modeling of seawater intrusion and liquid waste injection into island aquifers. His dissertation involved the numerical modeling of the same problem. Dr. Wheatcraft's keynote topic will be Fractal Approaches to Modeling Geologic Variability in Aquifers. He was invited to 31 universities during the 1990-91 school year to give this particular lecture. The following was taped at The Ohio State University.
What I'd like to talk to you about today is a summary of some of the research that we've been doing the past 3 to 4 years, in which we've been looking into the effects of spatial variability on transport of contaminants in groundwater. The effects of spatial variability or heterogeneity are a major research issue in terms of groundwater hydrology and how the effects of spatial variability affect our ability to predict transport of solutes and contaminants in the groundwater. And to that extent, our research is focused on that issue the last several years. And we've been using fractal geometry as a model for natural geologic variability. And so what I'd like to do is talk to you about 3 basic topics, or my talk will be broken down into 3 basic topics. First, I will talk about an introduction to fractal scaling so that we get acquainted with some of the basic notions of fractals. And then we'll talk about a very simple random walk model that looks at scale-dependent dispersion processes in 1 dimension. And then we'll look at dispersion processes in synthetic media in 2 dimensions, both deterministic media and random media. The first 3 topics will be about 90% of the talk, and I will talk briefly about some of the work that we've been doing with unsaturated flow, looking at soil water retention properties using fractal models, and perhaps talk a moment about future directions. These slides summarize in a general way the ways in which we attack developing theories and the way we think about transport processes in porous media. And the idea is that we start here on the left with a small scale, in our case here the pore scale, and we write equations which describe in the pore scale in a point at the pore scale what's going on. Mass conservation equations, energy conservation equations, etc. And then, of course, at the pore scale, the porous medium is very heterogeneous, and we can't hope to solve these equations because our boundary conditions would have to include the very complex geometry of the pores, which we can't do. So what we do is we take these point equations and we average them to a larger scale. And visually, what we hope the porous medium looks like after averaging is something like it does here on the right. In other words, it goes from being very heterogeneous to being hopefully relatively homogeneous. And so in this case, we average from the pore scale to the macroscopic scale. What we found once we had done this kind of process was that many, or probably most, geologic materials don't look very much like this if you've ever looked at outcrops, and as we'll do in just a minute. And we found that it was useful to visualize the porous medium on a let's say an outcrop size scale as something like this, where we now have, instead of solid grains and pore spaces, we now have patches of different permeability. And then we develop, again though, we can't tell you exactly what's going on. We can write an equation for a point inside one of these patches of material, but then we have different patches of material, and each of which has different hydraulic properties. So we again just average from this scale to a larger scale. This time we usually do a slightly different averaging procedure, but it's really the same idea, so that when we get to a larger scale, then we again have what we hope is a homogeneous looking porous medium. And this time, the average properties on the larger scale are based on the statistical distributions of the hydraulic conductivities at the smaller scale. So in both cases, though, there's a couple of things we would like to remember. First is that there's a distinct separation of scales between the small scale and the large scale. And our theories depend on that separation of scale in order for them to work. And what we end up doing is replacing the details of the geometry at the small scale with parameters in the equations at the large scale, which describe in some average way the properties that we're losing by the averaging process. Well, it's useful to go to the field and look at real geologic materials and see how well they hold up to that basic theoretical premise. And I've shown here a couple of pictures of an outcrop, a couple of outcrops. And I think geologists have known that there's a scale problem, or problem of telling scales for a long time, because they routinely put something in the picture that tells us what the scale is, a lens cap or a rock hammer or a ruler or something like that. Sometimes even that's not enough. Just in case, let's see if I can move these backwards so you can see that they're the same outcrops on both sides, just a different lens cap. The one on the left, of course, is a real lens cap in a relatively small area, and the one on the right is a relatively large area. But in fact, this part of the outcrop that you see here is actually a part that's somewhere right around in here. So what we find is that we don't have this separation of scales that we were hoping to find with the theories that we just discussed. The material looks just as heterogeneous in a qualitative kind of way at the larger scale as it does at the small scale. And this causes problems in terms of developing predictive theories. Now, one thing we could do would be to say that the material is self-similar. One way to describe the kind of heterogeneity that we see here is to say that it's self-similar over a relatively wide range of scales. And a property of self-similarity is one of the basic properties of fractals, which is what led us to be interested in fractals. And we have here images of the relatively famous Mandelbrot set. Many of you have probably seen these images or something similar to them before, in which what I've done here is on the right, this is a relatively large portion of the Mandelbrot set, and I've outlined a little square here and then blown that square up over here on the left. And you can see that the features that you see at the small scale, like the spiral, are reproduced on a larger scale. And you could then, for instance, go into a smaller scale and look at a very small area like this, and it would be similar to the area that we see on this scale. Another property of fractals is that makes them attractive is that they've already been used to simulate natural geologic processes, albeit on the surface. And they're relatively successful at mimicking geologic, or at least terrain. And so it seems natural to go ahead and imagine that we can use some of these algorithms that produce the surface topography to produce algorithms to simulate real geologic materials or porous media in the subsurface. Similarly, we can use fractal algorithms to simulate a wide variety of processes, from the landforms that we saw in the previous slides to clouds, which we see here, and on a much larger scale, an image of the Earth, or actually an artificial Earth in this case. So that's some of the motivation behind why we are interested in using fractals to simulate geologic materials. The slide on the left here shows a conceptual model of a self-similar depositional model of a geologic material that we put together to visualize the concepts. And the idea here is that we have some kind of a lens of material that's been deposited. In a real situation, you probably would think of this lens as being longer horizontally than it is, by quite a bit, than it is vertically. But inside this lens, we've got 3 more lenses, and in each of those lenses, we have 3 more, and each of those, there's 3 more, etc., so that if we were to zoom in on one of these small lenses and blow it up and reproduce it over here on the right, both lenses would look similar at different scales, which, of course, is the idea of self-similarity. This property is reinforced on the slide here on the right to show one of the things people oftentimes think when they first see fractals is that a fractal is something that's very irregular. And it's not just a property of irregularity that makes something fractal, it's how irregular it looks over a wide variety of scales. You'll see on the left here, we reproduce a very irregular line, and then we take this little square and zoom in on it in the middle so that the trace that you see here is the same one that you see here. And then we take this square here and reproduce it on the top. Well, this is a non-fractal scaling, so even though we start with a irregular line, it turns out that line doesn't have fractal properties, because when we get down to a small enough scale, we can measure the length of this line, and everybody who did it would agree as to what the length of the line was, and would be no problem. On the other hand, we start with the same kind of line over here on the right, and now we zoom in on this square, which we show here, and then we zoom in on this square, which we show up here on the top. And you see that each time we zoom in, new detail appears at the smaller scales, so that the line is just as irregular at the small scale as it is at the large scale. And when you have this kind of scaling, which we call fractal scaling, it presents some difficulties in terms of measuring the length of this line, or if it's something other than the line, then some difficulty in terms of measuring the important properties of what we're interested in. So let's do an experiment and see how we might go about measuring the length of that line from the previous slide. We've reproduced a similar irregular line here in this slide. And one way to measure the length would be to use a pair of dividers. And we set the dividers at a distance between the points, which we'll call epsilon. And then we walk those dividers along the line until we go all the way from the left to the right, counting the number of times it takes to cover the line. Thus, if n is the number of times that it takes this pair of dividers to cover the line, then n times epsilon would be the length of the line as measured for that distance with the dividers, the epsilon. But what happens is if we then reduce the distance between the points so that epsilon is quite a bit smaller, and we do the same experiment, what we'll find is that at a reduced level, we'll pick up more of the ins and outs of this curve that we didn't see at the larger scale, or that the dividers didn't pick up. And so the second time we take this measurement, even though epsilon is smaller, n will grow disproportionately large, and the length that we measure at the smaller epsilon will be longer. Now, if we do that for a number of different lengths, what we've done here is taken the experiment from the previous slide and reproduced this data. On the x-axis is the log of epsilon, the divider length, and on the y-axis is n, which is the number of times it takes to cover the line. And what we see is on a log-log scale, these values plot as a straight line. And when this happens, which happens quite a bit with natural phenomena such as that line, this is what we refer to as fractal scaling, and the slope of this line is referred to as the fractal dimension, or the minus the slope. So if this is a straight line on a log-log plot, we can immediately write an equation that says that n, which is the y-axis, is equal to a constant times epsilon raised to the power minus d, where epsilon is the x-axis. So equation here is just gotten from this straight line power law relationship on the left. If f is a constant which is related to the intercept the line has on the y-axis, if f is a constant, let's go ahead and rearrange this equation solving for f, which we've done on the second line here. So we find that f is equal to n times epsilon raised to a power d, where n times epsilon to the power d is a constant because f is a constant. Now let's compare that with that previous equation, or this equation from the previous slide. We saw that if we took n times epsilon, that was a measure of the length of the line. So as a result, if we're measuring a one-dimensional line, you can think of this as being n times epsilon raised to the power 1, and then compare that with this equation where we have n times epsilon raised to a power d. This power d here for a line is a value which ranges between 1 and 2. And because of the similarity of this expression to this expression, d gets interpreted as being a dimension. Because in this case, we're measuring the length of this line with a pair of dividers which are measuring in one dimension. And here, it's as if we were measuring the length of this line with a pair of dividers that somehow had a dimension greater than 1 but less than 2. And if we get just exactly the right dimension, and the right dimension being given to us by the slope of this line, then n times epsilon raised to that power will be a constant. And we now have a way to measure the length of the line in terms of this fractal dimension, where the length of the line is a constant instead of being a variable. If we combine these equations, eliminating n between them, we get the equation here on the bottom, which then tells us that the length of the line as measured using the yardstick, or the dividers, is equal to this constant f times epsilon raised to a power 1 minus d. A simple pedagogical way to think of this is to imagine a coastline. Let's say the coastline between LA and Santa Barbara or something like that, where you're interested in this coastline, let's say because you're a surfer and you're going to want to know what's the length of the coastline that you need to patrol in order to protect all the surfers. And so what you do is you take the measurements of that coastline, along that coastline, to get the value d and the value f. And if you thought of the patrol as being a lifeguard walking along the beach, then epsilon would be the average step size that the lifeguard would take, which might be something in the neighborhood of ½ a meter. So you would plug that into this equation here, and then determine the length of the line, the length of the coastline that you would have to patrol. But let's say that you were in the same length of coastline, you were a biologist interested in a certain type of crab which only existed in the intertidal zone, and you wanted to know the length of the habitat that that crab would experience. Then you would take the step size of the crab, which would be a lot smaller, plug that into this equation, and of course you'd get a lot longer coastline effectively for the crab. And so you can use that. And we've actually used that kind of relationship to measure dissolution of salt along the coastline of Lake Mead. Okay, well, to just reinforce this in terms of some simple mathematics, if we have the scaling of a non-fractal line, what I did here is just draw a line that's a series of vertices, and the question that we're going to ask, because this gets into the issue of transport, is how long is this line, what's the total length of this line as a function of the straight line distance along the x-axis. So we'll call the straight line distance along the x-axis x sub s, and we'll call the total length of that line x sub f. And in this case, because it's a very simple geometrical relationship, we see that x sub f is equal to 2n over cosine alpha. And so what we have is a linear relationship. The distance along that line is linearly related to the distance along the Cartesian axis, the x-axis. Now, we could just randomize this line so that instead of being a nice geometrical form such that we come out with a closed form solution here, we might have to, instead of getting 2n over cosine alpha, we might get a parameter epsilon if we randomize this line, which would have to be measured with some experiment. But it's the same idea for a non-fractal line. The total length of this line is linearly related to the Cartesian distance, the x-axis. Okay, I've just repeated the slide that was on the right over here on the left, and then we're going to compare that with the fractal line. And in this case, the fractal line, we still have x sub f, and then we have x sub s, the distance along the x-axis. And if we rewrite the equation from a couple of slides back so that instead of using L, we use x sub f, then we get this equation here. It tells us that the distance along that line is related to, or is equal to, a constant which we will call epsilon sub c raised to a power times x sub s raised to the power 1 minus d. So what we see here is that the distance along a fractal line is nonlinearly related to the straight line distance, which turns out to be an important distinction between a fractal scaling process and a non-fractal scaling process. So it's a nonlinear relationship where the nonlinearity is related to the fractal dimension. Another way of thinking of the fractal dimension, which I meant to mention a couple of slides ago, is that in terms of that straight line, you can think of the fractal dimension, you can interpret that as being a measure of the rate at which that line grows as you reduce the yardstick or the pair of dividers that you use to measure it by. Okay, well, just a couple of more things. This really just reinforces what we've been talking about. We take that fractal scaling relationship and we use a well-known fractal curve called the von Koch curve, and we measure the ability of that scaling relationship to measure the distance along that line. So we have the actual, which is just counting the little line segments that we have here, versus the predicted that's calculated by our scaling relationship. And it turns out that in some cases the two agree exactly, and other cases there's a little bit of difference. The points where they agree exactly for this kind of a fractal are this point here, and at the end. And of course you might guess that the reason they agree exactly is that this image here is an exact self-similar copy of the whole thing. But if you randomize this fractal and plot the actual versus the calculated, you'll find that it does a very good job of predicting the true length of this line as a function of the straight line distance. This slide here just illustrates the fact that even though the distances that we calculate, you can't see this too well in the bottom, but the straight line distance is calculated with a epsilon of 1/3, where 1/3 is 1/3 of the distance across here, is equal to 1.333. And then if we reduce our divider to 1/9, the straight line distance is about 1.8. But if we measure the fractal dimension for both of them, we get the same value. So the fractal dimension is a better measure of the characteristic of that line than the length is. It's consistent. Okay, well, now let's take this really goes from the first part of the talk to the second part of the talk, where we use these ideas of fractal scaling to develop a very simple 1D random walk model. And the issue that we want to address is the fact that we found in field studies that the dispersivity in our models is scale dependent in heterogeneous aquifers. The dispersivity is the parameter in our models which measures the rate at which a contaminant plume will spread or will disperse. And the measure, what we find is that we start a contaminant plume moving in an aquifer, and we measure the dispersivity, or I should say we take measurements which allow us to calculate the dispersivity. So we get one value, we plug that back into our model to predict where the plume will go and how fast it will spread, and it spreads faster than our model predicts. And we have to increase the value of dispersivity in order to get the model to fit the reality. And even then we increase that value. If we let the plume move further through the aquifer, we have to increase the value again. Hence we have a model that has no predictive value or has very little predictive value. And this is where a lot of the research is focused the past 10 years or so, is developing models which will better predict that and get values, different expressions for dispersivity which will be more predictive. The reason our models are not working is because the process which causes dispersion at the field scale is what we call differential advection. In other words, the dispersion process is caused by the differing values of hydraulic conductivity that we experience from point to point within the aquifer. And as a result, the dispersivity turns out to be a predictive or a fitting parameter with very little predictive value. So we're going to develop a one-dimensional fractal random walk model, and we'll compare that results to both traditional models, which we get up here, and also some of the newer stochastic models. The way we develop this model is by simply thinking of the idea that we're going to follow a particle using a Lagrangian method or a Lagrangian type coordinate system. So we're going to think of a particle as moving from point A to point B under some regional gradient from left to right. So in order for that particle to move from point A to point B, it's not going to take a straight line. It will deviate from the straight line according to the natural variability of the materials. And so instead of taking this straight line, it will deviate along the red line that we're showing here. But we've created two straight lines with the red line. And so in getting from this point to this point, the particle will deviate according to the green line. But then again, we've created two straight lines, which we can again bisect into two other lines. So we do that over and over again, in other words, recursively, and we end up with an algorithm that produces a trace that looks like this. I've shown this at first deterministically so you can see how the algorithm works. Now we can go back and say, instead of bisecting the line exactly in half, and instead of coming up exactly the same amount each time, we can randomize the point at which we bisect and randomize the distance that we come up from that model. When we do that, we get results like this, where we apply it several times recursively, and then we just show the whole thing over here. And we start seeing a trace or a track that looks something like what we might envision a particle taking through a very heterogeneous porous medium. So really the hypothesis that we're testing here is, we're assuming that a particle is following a fractal path through a porous medium. And from that assumption, we'll see what kind of properties emerge. So what we do is we create, since it's a random process, we can create many different realizations of that process. And I've just superimposed a couple of dozen realizations here on the left to imagine this as being kind of like what we call an ensemble average. In other words, it's the average of many different realizations. And so we see what almost looks like a dispersion process from particles being emitted from a point. And then we run the same model only over a much larger scale. This one, it's kind of hard to see on the slide, but it goes 0 to 100 and 0 to 100 length units, whatever length units you want to use. And the one on the right goes 0 to 400 and 0 to 400. So it's 4 times larger on a side, or 16 times the area, the one on the right. And the model looks the same, roughly speaking, both on the small scale version and the large scale version, which it should because it's a fractal model and it has the property of self-similarity. Now, each of these, so what we do with this model is we release particles along these tracks where each particle has a constant velocity and each particle has the same velocity. So the only variable is the length of the track. And so some of the particles which follow the shorter tracks will break through here on the right rather quickly. Other particles will take a longer time, and some of the particles that take the longest tracks will take a very long time. And then we develop what we call a breakthrough curve over here on the right, which means that simply we're going to look at the breakthrough of these particles as they pass this line on the right as a function of time. So we do that. And the dashed line shows the ensemble average of the breakthrough for those particles. So we see the first ones to break through are the ones that take the shortest path, and then these would be the ones that are following paths of more or less average length, and then these up here would be the paths that take the longest time to break through. So what we do then, first thing we notice is that this breakthrough curve looks like a standard breakthrough curve that would be obtained from an advection dispersion model, a traditional model of dispersion. And so we go ahead and calculate a dispersivity that fits that model. The value of dispersivity in this case is about 0.2 meters, assuming that the length units along the x-axis are meters. So we now have basically some so-called real data, although obviously generated in the computer, and we have a model that we hope is predictive. So then we run this model over a larger scale, just like we did on the previous two slides, and the data from that model is shown here on the right. And then we simply run the predictive model using the same value of dispersivity that we obtained from the smaller run. And of course we can see that the dispersion predicted by the model is a lot less than that predicted than actually occurs. So we would have to increase the value of dispersivity to make this match up again. And in fact, to make this match, you'd have to increase the dispersivity by roughly a factor of 10. So we show, the thing that we've shown here is that a fractal random walk model can produce the scale-dependent dispersion that we see in the field. So that's possibly one way to explain the scale-dependent dispersion. This just summarizes what we just talked about so that we don't really need to go over that again. What we get out of that model is an apparent dispersivity that is given by this equation here on the bottom that says the dispersivity is proportional to the distance traveled by the mean particle raised to a power 2d minus 1, where d is the fractal dimension of the particle trace that the particles are traveling along. Now we can take these results and we can look at them in comparison to what other theories would predict. And what we have here on the x-axis is the travel distance, and on the y-axis we have the variance. The variance and the dispersivity are very closely related to each other. But the line that we show here is the line that we would expect. It's the way the model would behave if we were using a traditional advection dispersion model. The line that's shown here, this one here, which is the second from the top, so to speak, is the line that you would expect if you had a layered material where the hydraulic conductivity of each layer was different, but that you could describe that hydraulic conductivity according to a normal distribution. The line that's in between those two lines is a summary of the results from what we call modern stochastic theories. That is, theories which develop dispersivities based on the statistical properties of the hydraulic conductivity. And what they do is that at short times or short travel distances, they actually agree with the layered model. And at long times, their results are parallel. In other words, they agree with results from the traditional dispersion models. Now, the line that's on top here, which has a higher slope than any of the other three, is the slope that we get from our fractal model that we just looked at. So what we've got is a situation where the fractal model is predicting results that are unique from any of the other models. That could be good or bad news. If we see evidence that dispersion is happening at a rate that's roughly equivalent to this, then it's the only model we have that could explain that dispersion. However, if we see dispersion from one of these other, or if it falls in here, then it could be predicted by any of these other theories, and this fractal theory wouldn't be a very good explanation. So the question is, do we have field data that we can use to help us support one of these hypotheses or one of these models over another one? And there's the answer, the really most correct answer is no, we don't, but we do have a lot of field data that we can look at and arrive at some very tentative conclusions. What we've shown here on the slide on the right are dispersivity values, which is the y-axis, versus scale, that is mean travel distance, on the x-axis. And these are data from experiments that have been done all over the world, so we're really comparing apples and oranges. That's why we can't draw certain conclusions from it. But what we do see is that experiments that tend to take place on small scales have relatively low dispersivities, and the larger the scale of the experiment, the larger the values of dispersivities. And what I've done here is I've placed a line on here. The line on this graph is the same line as this one right here. It's the same line as the layered model. Now, if you use that argument, then you could draw a line through many of the smaller scale values where it tends to indicate that dispersion is happening at a rapid rate, a rate more rapid than predicted by the layered model and more rapid than predicted by the other models. So if you were looking just at the data values from about 200 meters down to 1 meter, then these data tend to support this very simple one-dimensional fractal theory that we came up with. The larger scale values tend to, by the people who collected it or assembled these data, are given quite a bit less weight because they all come from back calculations out of numerical models. They're not directly from field experiments like these ones from the smaller scales are. But the way we see this is evidence that makes us feel that it's important to go ahead and look into the idea of the fractal dispersion a little more carefully. It certainly doesn't prove anything. So the first thing we want to do is the random walk model was a very simple model that wasn't really even based on real physics. It was just based on this hypothesis that we're tracing particles moving through a fractal porous medium. So we said, let's actually create a synthetic material and solve real fluid flow and solute transport equations through this material and see if we see similar behavior to what we saw in the previous simple model. So we started with a deterministic model that is based on the idea of the Sierpinski carpet, one of the classic fractals that you see in all the literature. And the idea here in terms of a geologic material is that the black squares are low permeability and the blue material around is relatively high permeability. So in fact, the black squares are a value of 1 and the blue areas are a value of 100. So there's 2 orders of magnitude difference in permeability. So it's kind of like the idea of having large, low permeability lenses and then say a few very large low permeability lenses, a lot of smaller low permeability lenses, and then a whole bunch of really small low permeability lenses. So what we do then is we set up some boundary conditions which are fixed potentials on the left and a lower fixed potential on the right and a no-flow boundary on the top and bottom. So we're going to get a regional, sort of what you'd call a regional gradient from left to right. And we solve the fluid flow equation using a multi-grid solution technique developed by Charlie Cole and Harlan Foote at Battelle Labs in Washington. Once we have the steady-state solution to the flow equation, that information is input to a particle tracking model, which then releases particles over on the left, and it tracks their values throughout the system, and then we collect the particles as they exit on the right, just as we did before. So this set of particles was released, and it's traveled a little ways into the material, and then this one up here is further in the time step, and so they've traveled quite a way. Some of them have actually exited the system, whereas others are being held back in these low permeability zones. And another way of looking at this would be to take an individual particle and keep track of its coordinates, which we've done over here, and then we can calculate fractal dimensions of these particle tracks. So we did all that, and I don't want to get into minute details of the results of those experiments, but they actually supported the results of our 1D random walk model. That is, dispersion occurred at a rate faster than we would have expected from layered models or stochastic theories or from traditional advection dispersion models. Well, that wasn't a very realistic geologic material, as you might immediately guess. And so we wanted to go to an algorithm which would produce something more realistic, which we've done using something called fractional Brownian motion, or its derivative, fractional Gaussian noise. And the way this works, actually there's a number of ways to generate fractional Brownian motion synthetic data, but the best way to think of it is in terms of its spectral characteristics. You can think, if you think of frequency versus spectral density, the power, in other words, associated with each frequency, White noise is simply equal power at all frequencies, and that's given by a trace that looks like this. Then if you have what's called 1 over f noise, it's this green one, and 1 over f cubed noise looks like the yellow one. Anything in between has fractal properties where this 1 over f is a fractal dimension of 2, and 1 over f cubed is a fractal dimension of 1. And so you can kind of see these traces here on the slide on the right. Fractional Brownian motion has the property that if the fractal dimension is between 1 and 1.5, then it has positive correlation, and its correlation scale is infinite. In other words, the correlation, it's correlated over the entire data set. If the fractal dimension is from 1.5 to 2, then it still has infinite correlation, but the correlation is negative. So large values tend to be followed by small values and vice versa. Whereas if it's from 1 to 1.5, large values tend to be followed by large values, and low values tend to be followed by low values. If we look at this in 2 dimensions, which we've done over here, it starts to look like this, where the elevation of the surface is the value, and we're now going to think of this as a hydraulic conductivity in 2 dimensions. And I've reproduced here on the right a 2-dimensional normal distribution just to show that there's a very different kind of data set using this kind of a random number, a random distribution as compared to a normal distribution. So we're going to do the same kind of experiments that we did on the Sierpinski carpet, only now we're going to look over several scales. We're going to choose a large scale, do an experiment through that large scale, then select a portion of this material, the 1/4 of it, and do an experiment in that material, and then take 1/4 of that and do an experiment in that. So we have experiments over different scales that are done in that way. So what I've done here is to show, go from looking at a 3D perspective to just looking down on the values, where now the color here is associated with the value of the hydraulic conductivity. So a purple color is a value of 100, and then a very dark blue color is a value of 1, and then the other colors in between range from 1 to 100. The other thing I've added here is a degree of anisotropy so that it looks more like a layered sedimentary material. And then if we go, instead of using the color scheme, the rainbow color scheme that we use here on the right, we color this according to kind of a grayscale. It actually starts looking, at least somewhat subjectively, like a geologic material. So now we do the same kind of experiment, fixed potential on the right and left, no flow boundaries on the top and bottom, solve the fluid flow equation, and then track particles through the material. Now we're coloring the particles according to the rainbow colors that we just saw, where the red-purple values are high velocities and the dark blue values are low velocities. The green particles are traveling at the average pore velocity. So we release this material on the left and it starts flowing. We just now look at a time series of these things. We see that even when some of the particles are exiting the system here, there's still particles way back here caught up in the low permeability zones. And then this just summarizes our results. These show some of the ensemble average breakthrough curves for that set of experiments. But really what I want to do is just emphasize that the results of those experiments were consistent with the fractal theory. That is, the dispersion occurred at a rate faster than would have been predicted by the other theories. There's another possible explanation as to why dispersion could occur faster than these theories would account for, and that is tied up in the idea that dispersion is really a 3-dimensional process, and we're trying to model it as a 2-dimensional process. And there's some work that suggests, that people have done, that suggests that if you try and model what's inherently a 3-dimensional process in 2 dimensions, you'll get an artificially high amount of dispersion taking place. And so we felt that it was necessary to go to 3 dimensions so that we were testing things properly. So now we generate the same kind of random distribution, only in 3 dimensions. So we're looking at a cube of simulated subsurface material here, where the colors in this cross-section, this is a cross-section of it, and the colors are again representative of the values of the hydraulic conductivity. And now we'll sweep this cross-section through the cube. At 3 dimensions, of course, it gets hard to visualize the data all at once in any meaningful sort of way. So we start with what we call a cutting plane sweeping through the volume. And what I want you to notice is that the general trends, you'll see, you can kind of see it here on this one. There's a high permeability zone here on the right in the back corner. And then there's a low permeability zone that kind of extends linearly like this and kind of moves back into the cube. And then we can look at this using a different visualization technique where we now enclose equal values of hydraulic conductivity. And so we've enclosed all the high values in the gold isosurface, and we've enclosed all the relatively low values in the blue isosurface. So you get a feeling for what this three-dimensional realization of a permeability field looks like in this case. Of course, this one is statistically isotropic. It's not anisotropic like the one we just looked at. So again, we do the same kind of set of experiments where we fix potentials on this face here and a higher fixed potential on the back face, and the 4 faces around the sides then are going to be no flow boundaries. We solve the fluid flow equation, and we do that for this 3 different scales. We do it at a scale of 16 grid blocks on a side, so 16 cubed, and then 32, and then 64. And this shows the results from, I think, like the 32 sample, where while the hydraulic conductivity is still there, we're not going to be able to see it because we're going to visualize the particles moving through the material. And the particles are colored with according to the log of their velocity. So again, the high velocity particles are this reddish color, and the low velocity particles are this dark blue or gray, actually gray, I guess, in this case. So they all start out at the same time here, and then at a further time step, you start seeing the effects of the permeability making some particles move faster than others, as you would guess. And then we look at several more time steps, and notice, if you remember from the visualization, there was that high permeability zone back there at the back right side of the cube, and you can see the effects of that, and you can see the effects of that low permeability zone by this whole material here being held back. And just a couple more time steps, and then this one I rotate the cube so we're looking at it edge on, so you get to see the edge on effect. These images were all done on a Silicon Graphics Iris, and you can, which is a scientific workstation that has very fast 3D graphics. And you can take these cubes on the workstation and rotate them in real time as the particles are moving through the system. Most of the time when have been giving this lecture, at that point I said that we've just started the 3D simulations and we're not sure of the results. We have in fact finished most of the 3D simulations, and we get some very different behavior for the 3D simulations than we do for the 2D or 1D simulations. And I don't have some slides to show you the results. I actually talked about them a little bit at the fall AGU meeting. But the result is that it depends. The question we want to ask is, do we still see that anomalously high dispersion, or does it look more like one of the other theories? And the answer is both, as it turns out. If you look at the particles as they swarm or move through the entire cube, you see results that actually look very much like the stochastic theories, which is quite a surprise, in fact. But then if you go and you do the experiments on the subsampling, on the smaller scale and then the smaller scale, you find that the results from the small scale won't predict what you see at the larger scale. You have to increase your parameters. So it actually is analogous to the problem you get trying to measure the length of that fractal line. It depends on the size of the calipers that you use in terms of the value you get. So we're still sorting that out. We're not completely done with that, but it was some very interesting results. Okay, that's the first 3 parts of the talk. that I started with on dividing it up in the first slide. I said that we were going to take just a couple of minutes and look at some of the unsaturated zone work that we've done. This work has been done primarily, well, the first author, if you will, is my colleague Scott Tyler. And we've done quite a bit of work that looks at water retention and other hydraulic properties using fractal models. This was one of the first things that we did, where we just looked at a very simple model of water retention that was produced by Aria and Paris in 1981, where the model is based solely on the particle size distribution. And the idea is that it's a capillary tube diameter where we make the tube diameter proportional to the grain diameter, and the water content is proportional to the grain size distribution with arbitrary pore and grain size divisions. And there's an arbitrary or empirical fitting parameter in this method, which they call alpha. And so what we did is said, okay, Aria and Paris model looks at the particles like this. They'll think of some capillary tubes where each capillary tube is composed of all the particles of a certain size diameter d. So we said, let's rearrange this and think about it in more of a self-similar fractal way, where the particles are stacked up like this, where we have big particles next to small particles, but the small particles, if you zoomed in on them, would look like a big particle next to a small particle. So you get a self-similarity. And when you work out the math, you get a model which predicts water retention properties like we see here on the left, where the different curves are for different fractal dimensions, and then the values that are plotted are actual values from a particular soil. And so you see that the model's quite sensitive to the fractal dimension that you choose, and it turns out to be a rather effective way to characterize water retention. And the nice thing about the model is that it removes the empiricism from the model. Before, the only way to get the alpha parameter in their model was to do a water retention experiment in the lab, where you saturate a sand column and then you let it drain, measuring capillary pressure as a function of volumetric water content, which is a rather difficult experiment to do in the laboratory. But that was the only way to get their alpha parameter. What we were able to show is the alpha parameter is the fractal dimension of the particle size distribution, and so we can get that from a sieve analysis. So you simply do a sieve analysis, and from that you can directly calculate the alpha, which turns out to be directly related to the fractal dimension. And this shows the fractal dimensions of a variety of soils. One question that people often ask is, well, what do you mean by fractal dimension of the particle size distribution? They kind of got an understanding of what that was for lines and so forth, but it doesn't quite make sense. And the best way to think of it is it's a model of disaggregation. If you imagine taking, let's say, your mother's finest lead crystal wine glass and you accidentally drop it on the kitchen floor, if this has ever happened to you, you might ask, well, how does this glass actually break? Does it break according to a normal distribution where there's a few big particles and a few small particles and lots of average-sized particles? What actually happens when something with that kind of an experiment is that it breaks into a couple of large fragments, a lot of intermediate-sized fragments, and a whole hell of a lot of very small fragments, which take days and days to clean up from the kitchen floor. And this kind of a disaggregation model has a fractal property to it, which says that there's lots more small particles than there are large particles, and the degree as to how many more small particles there are than large particles is measured by the fractal dimension of that. It didn't work very well for this sand. The fractal dimension falling less than 1, of course, is an indication that it wasn't a very good model for that particular kind of a soil. Since we've done this work, we've done several other pieces of work that are out in the literature, including one that's, I think, just out in the Journal of Soil Science Society of America this month, which places some limitations on the work that we did here, which we didn't indicate or didn't know about in the first paper. Well, this kind of summarizes some of the ideas of scaling. Ed Miller is a rather famous soil physicist from the University of Wisconsin, he and his brother Bob Miller really pioneered the ideas of scaling and similitude with respect to soil physics in the 1950s, and his definition of scaling is that scaling simplifies problems by expressing them in the smallest number of reduced variables. Any solution for a problem that's been worked out in reduced formulation holds true for an infinite variety of actual systems, which are simply scale models of each other. Well, as you might guess, this is a good model of scaling for linear problems. But if you have a nonlinear scaling, this model of scaling doesn't work very well at all. Probably a more general definition of scaling is given by some colleagues at the Salinity Lab at UC Riverside, which is that the scaling is a systematic method for specifying a change of variable that transforms one system to another with more desirable traits. And that's kind of what we see happening with fractal scaling. So this is actually a definition which includes fractal scaling by the way it's worded. And that's about it. The sunset here on the left is a real sunset that was taken on the Nile River in Egypt, and the one on the right, it's a sunset that was generated entirely with fractal algorithms in the computer. So, thanks very much.
For more information on groundwater resources or to obtain additional copies of this videotape presentation, write NGWA Order Department, 6375 Riverside Drive, Dublin, Ohio, 43017, or phone area code 614-761-1711.